Well, let's get things going. Let's get this shindig started. Welcome, everyone, to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your host, organizer, and chief cat herder for the hour. And today we're going to be looking into the future of education and technology through the lens of digital libraries. Let me just welcome everybody. Now, if you haven't been here before, let me just quickly introduce you to the technology that you're in. Shindig is a video conferencing tool, and if you're used to other tools, it has some similarities and some differences. To begin with, right up here on the top of the screen where I am, and next to me where you should see a few different slides, this is called the stage, and everyone gets to hear what's on stage and see what's on stage. Today's guest is going to come up on there in just a couple of minutes. Down below, you should see a swarm of other people, each represented by either a photo or video feed and a name. Each one of those represents a sign-in and probably one person from somewhere around the world. That's the audience space. And the audience space is clumped into a single room based on about 20 or 18 people. You'll be able to see more and more people come in. Now that's on the bottom right of the screen. You should be able to see a couple of little orange dots. One of them has a hand raised and the word raise. If you click that, that tells us that you'd like to come up on stage. So if your camera is working and your mic is working and you have something to say, a question or a comment, just click that, we'll get in our line and we'll bring you up on stage as soon as we can. If on the other hand you'd rather interact by typing, click the ask button and type in a question or a comment. Then we can throw that on the screen, I can read it out loud, and we can share that way. Now if you'd like to socialize with the people in your room, mouse over your cursor, click on the little box that says I am chat, and you'll get a text box, and you can chat to the people who are in your room. Now, we don't get to read every single room simultaneously, so this is more of a social function. It's also a good place to hash out some ideas. Now, if that's not enough for interactivity, you can head over to Twitter and use the hashtag FTTE, and already we've got some discussion going on there. So, if you haven't been to this before, the Future Trends Forum is extremely interactive. Now, let's take a look at how this works. Next slide, please. Just to let you know some background, the Future Trends Forum comes out of my Future Trends in Technology and Education research project, which has been going on for years now. That's a monthly environmental scan that takes a look at trends in the present that we think are likely to drive changes in the future, specifically about education and technology. If you're new to it, click on ftte.us and take a look and sign up. Now, we do want to thank a few people for making all this possible. First, we want to thank NiserNet from New York State, a terrific network who's been very generous in their sponsorship of FTTE. We're going to say a little bit more about them before we leave today. And also making this possible is Shindig. And just so you know, Shindig has two levels of support for this, one visible and one maybe not so visible. The visible is this, the technology, which they make available. We're very grateful for that. But at the same time, Shindig has a terrific support staff who do great work making all of this happen, making sure all the bells are rung, all the T's are crossed, and all the I's are dotted. So I want to thank them very much for their generous support. Now, speaking of support, we have a guest this week I'm just really excited to see. This is Dan Cohen. You may know him as the director of the Digital Public Library of America, DPLA, which is an extraordinary project we're going to be hearing about today. A really, really innovative work, which one expert called a Google for digital libraries, and I think that's faint praise. If you don't know Dan from DPLA, you might know him as one of the leading digital humanities activists, a guy who did tremendous work at the George Mason Center for History and New Media, a man who's written 2 books on digital history and traditional history, who's an organizer of that camp, a leading podcaster, very active in social media, one of the leading thinkers about digital technology and cultural heritage organizations. I'm just delighted to have Dan Cohen here. Let's pull the slides down and put Dan up on stage so we can get going. Dramatic moment where Dan comes to the stage. Welcome, Dan.
I made it. That was a long walk there, Brian, up to the stage, so it's delightful to be here. Thank you for having me on the forum.
Well, it's great to see you here. We really appreciate it. Are you in Boston today?
I am in Boston, where it is just glorious out, sunny. You are, I think, a couple hundred miles to my north, where it's probably even nicer. And,
it is nicer. It's nicer. It is about 70 or 75 here, and but I will be going by Boston over the next couple of weeks. We'll probably wave at you when we stop by.
Great.
Well, we have so much to talk about then, and I would like to get to the DPLA. But first, I'd like to ask your thoughts as a scholar and an observer and as a practitioner, not to mention a leader. What do you think is the status of digital libraries today in 2016? And where do you see them going?
Well, I think it's a really interesting time for digital libraries, and everything is expanding so rapidly. DPLA now has over 13 million items from 2,000 libraries, and I would say one of the first really signature features of a digital library is the fact that, in fact, it can synthesize and bring together multiple institutions, Brian. And I think that's really probably the best way that we can say, in a sense, they are an advance from regular libraries, although I'm a huge fan of physical libraries as well. And in fact, I work in one. I'm not working from there today, but our offices at DPLA are in the Boston Public Library. And so I think interesting things to say about the relationship between physical libraries and digital libraries that I can get to in a second. But just back to my original point, I think one of the things to point out is that there are tremendous new synthetic resources. Digital libraries can synthesize other libraries together virtually, and they can bring together their data, their metadata, so descriptive information about their holdings, and they can also bring together the actual artifacts that have been digitized. So, as I mentioned, DPLA has over 13 million items that have been digitized across the country and brought together for the first time in one place at dp.la. And there are similar projects that are sprouting up all around the world. Europeana has been in operation for 5 years longer than DPLA, and they're approaching, I believe, 50 million items from their 28 member states of the EU. There's Trove in Australia, which is run by the Digital Library of Australia, National Library of Australia. There's a very large-scale digital library there. Digital NZ in New Zealand. And I could go around the world as we see these crop up. There are these, again, tremendous projects that have brought together so many different institutions in one virtual space, as we are now talking here in this virtual room, and it's great to see all the faces out there in the audience. We do the same thing in digital libraries of bringing those together. And I think once that happens, I think it enables some really new things to occur. So not only is it synthesizing or kind of unifying a variety of different institutions under one umbrella, but I think it's also acting, as we like to say in DPLA, as a platform. So we're able to, with a very small staff, so DPLA is just 15 people right now, doing this work in collaboration with thousands of libraries, archives, and museums. And once we do that work, we're able to serve up that data to millions of people all around the world and actually enable others, whether they're software developers or librarians or educational technologists, to reuse that data in really new and innovative ways. And I think that notion of the digital library as a kind of foundation or a platform for others to do their work is another signature aspect of digital libraries.
So it depends heavily on openness, both as a philosophy and as a practice, along with technologies like APIs and adhering to common standards, right?
Yeah, it really does rely on openness. And you mentioned at the beginning sort of my prior work at George Mason and my activism, which has always been around open access. And in fact, I have a kind of even more expansive phrase that I'm using now, which I like to call maximal access. It's a stage even more than open access, of trying to figure out how we can maximize access to our shared culture, which is really what libraries hold, right? It is, in fact, our shared culture and cultures, right? Because a place like the United States is incredibly diverse. DPLA has materials in over 400 languages, which gives you some sense of the diversity of America's collections and America's communities. But all of this is founded on basic principles of open access. And I think I was just giving a talk in Washington last week at a conference on ethics and publishing, and there was a big discussion around ethics and what we have in our libraries. And my point was a simple one, which is that open access or maximal access is, in fact, it's an ethical viewpoint as well as a kind of practical one, as you mentioned, Brian. Of course, we need things to be open access in order to provide maximal access. So there's a kind of natural pragmatism to it, and really it is incredible what the web has enabled. I think it's worth pausing maybe once a week to realize, as much as we gripe about the internet, and we certainly all do that. My Twitter stream seems to be a constant stream of griping about the internet and about Twitter, but it is worth pausing maybe for 5 minutes a week to realize that still this medium and this technology has truly enabled something remarkable, which is that DPLA and our partners can serve up millions of items to anyone with an internet connection globally, and that's now billions of people. And it's worth just pausing again to realize that that is great and something special, and we should again work to maximize that access in every way that we can.
I remember meeting Sir Tim Berners-Lee for the first time informally, and I was just gobsmacked. I actually ended up having to hold the door open for him to be polite, and he said thanks. I said, well, you've opened so many doors for the human race, this is the least I can do. But do you? I have to say, your achievement is especially important. Thinking about the small size, you're up to 15 people right now.
Right.
To have such a tremendous collection. Well, that brings us back to the relationship between physical and digital. Then,
sure.
Can you expound on that a bit more? How do digital libraries depend on physical ones?
Right. So, I am still a huge proponent of physical libraries. I've been writing a lot recently. I think, Brian, you and I have had some private conversations around ebooks and libraries and the future of those. And I've been writing a lot on my blog recently about the future of ebooks. And one of the things I point in at is I still use public libraries all the time. I mean, for my personal use, for my children are avid readers and we go to the public library all the time. We also all read ebooks. And I think that there's a lot of complementary strengths to different media. And there's an overlap between them. I do think if you are a proponent of maximal access like I am, you should also be perhaps even first and foremost a proponent of funding public libraries and making sure that public libraries receive the resources they need, because every day when I go into Boston Public Library and I walk in at 9 a.m. when they open their doors, I see a tremendous population that is just far more disadvantaged than I am in so many ways, and I've been so lucky to be at institutions that have had great libraries and great resources. And we have to remember that there's a huge proportion of people, 20% of Americans receive significant internet access through their public library, for instance. So there's lots of services that the public library provides, obviously access to print books as well, and increasingly ebooks. But it is a period of transition, Brian, and I think it's actually worth asking in the future Transform how that transition will occur. A lot of my interest, both intellectual interest and then just a pragmatic and kind of ethical interest, is in seeing how we can move from and help public libraries maintain their centrality in culture and maintain a role of public access, while also acknowledging that in the future there's just going to be tremendous amounts of access coming from digital media, and we want to be central in that. We need to have nonprofit institutions and institutions that are in the long run business or the forever business, as libraries are, participate in that future. And I think it's incumbent upon us, all of us in this room, and all the faces out there, to work together toward that, because the other options are not great. and right now, Amazon has 65% of the ebook market. I have recently seen some estimates that it might go up as high as 90% because they're dominating the indie publishing market and emphasizing that actually through their various programs like their Kindle program. And I don't think that is a healthy place to be, as much as I'm an admirer of Amazon. I'm a member of Amazon Prime, and like so many other people, I obviously take advantage of them in our society, but I also think that it's worth considering that we have had these institutions called libraries that have generally been, in the long run, the places that we've relied on to provide access to things like books. And so I think we do need to kind of ramp up our savviness around the technology. And I hope that DPLA is playing a small role in that. We certainly have an interest around ebooks, a growing interest around ebooks. And we're trying to see what we can do, again, in collaboration with physical libraries to provide a continuum or spectrum of access from physical through the digital, and even some hybrid mechanisms where obviously you can locate a physical book using digital means and then go get it in person or have it delivered to you. So it is, I think it's an interesting decade right now. It's a really interesting time to be involved in libraries, in digital libraries. It's a time full of hand-wringing as well. And I think also one, unfortunately, of scarce resources and limited resources that I think is causing everyone to be concerned about that transition. But I do think that there's some promising developments. Again, I hope that DPLA can play a role as a kind of coordinator of action and as one that can provide platforms for other libraries to provide access through. So to me, it's right where we need to be right now. And I think there's still so much more we can do together on that project.
Well, I have so many responses to that. And one is I'm speaking to you from a public library, actually. So it's very appropriate. But before I can ask questions, we have one from Patrick, which is, he'd like to know, what can be done to encourage digital entrepreneurship in ebooks?
That is a great question.
If I could add to that just one little thing. We've mentioned before the idea of libraries or librarians becoming digital entrepreneurs or information entrepreneurs, trying to leverage better connections between people and information. And Patrick maybe bouncing off that. Yeah, please go ahead.
Right. Sure. A great question, Patrick. I think despite the dominance of Amazon and their programs, I think it's a really interesting time to be entrepreneurial around ebooks. Right now, things are a little bit stuck, and I think can use some entrepreneurial action both from the commercial sector and from the nonprofit sector. We're still in a phase, and I hear this all around the United States, and in fact, I just had a meeting with someone from Sweden yesterday to talk about the ebook situation in libraries there. They're in the same stuck situation where they really have trouble getting decent, really usable licenses for ebooks. They cost a lot of money, and often public libraries don't have the budget to acquire a lot of ebooks. There are some small companies and some nonprofit entities, including some public library consortia, that are looking at different models. For instance, a lot of licensing around ebooks, in some ways kind of bizarrely, considering the digital age we're in, maintain a licensing scheme that's very similar to a physical book, where you purchase an ebook, but despite the affordances of the ebook, right, theoretically unlimited people could read that at the same time, just as you can read a web page at the same time. But they're treated like physical books for circulation purposes in public libraries. And that is a very strange situation we've gotten ourselves into. So there are some startups that are exploring per circ or per circulation charges, 50 cents or $1, or providing access to books on an open access basis with the hope that physical books or physical versions of those books would be bought later on. I think there are a variety of developments around ebooks that are really interesting. Again, some of them are commercial, other ones are in libraries. There are libraries that are, for instance, focusing on curating locally produced EPUBs or ebooks by authors in their region that may be open access or that are independently produced and then license that local library. I think that's a wonderful thing for a library to do, just as there are similar programs to curate music from the region of the public library. Some interesting things going on around that area as well. There are libraries working together to cover what's called the first copy cost of a book. So books, by most estimates, if you look at the actual production costs, a lot of it has to do around acquisitions, editorial, copy editing, these sorts of things, as opposed to the actual physical printing of the book. When you look at that, you end up with a cost of between $25 and $40,000, somewhere in that range to sort of marshal a book from start to finish. Most of that is in the labor at a publisher. And of course, this is excluding the tremendous cost of actually writing a book if you're an author, which you pay out in blood, sweat, tears, and espresso coffee. But one of the things you can do is if you can find a consortium of libraries to cover that the first copy cost, the amount of money it takes to get to the final edition of that book, then you can make the rest of that book forevermore open access. So you've covered the basic costs, and there are groups that are doing those kinds of projects as well. So there's lots of things going on. Yeah. Sorry, what's that?
I'm sorry, is the library as publisher, basically?
Yeah, and there is, in fact, something called the Library Publishing Coalition, which includes members, mostly university members across the nation that are doing publishing. There are university publishers that exist within the library. The University of Michigan Press was recently merged back into the library. It used to be split off as a separate quasi-commercial entity. It's now returned back into the library, which gives it certain other abilities. And so I think there's a lot going on. Again, just to circle back to Patrick's good question, I think there's a lot going on. I think it's a good time to be creative. I think if you're a software developer, there are plenty of things you can do in terms of creating tools to produce, for instance, EPUB 3, which is the latest version of an international standard that includes the ability to create new kinds of works, multimedia ebooks, which is an area that I'm interested in, but hasn't, so far there's been, again, some experimentation, but still could be, a lot more could be done in that area. So I just think it's an area where we could use a lot more energy. We could use more entrepreneurship. And I think if someone comes up with a great idea, it could really solve problems on all sides of the ebook equation, the publisher side, the author side, and the reader side, in addition to the libraries that house those books. So put on your creative thinking caps and send me an email. I'd like to hear your ideas in this area.
That's terrific. And thank you again, Patrick, for a great question. Dan, I think in answering that, you circled back to an earlier point. When we think about the relationship between physical and digital libraries, are we seeing the development of a kind of second tier of libraries where digital libraries are thinner institutionally, requiring fewer people, obviously not so much bricks and mortar, and then they operate interstitially. They operate kind of like a trace, or not just consortially, but like a layover across a whole bunch of different sites. Should we be anticipating more of these, especially, you mentioned national examples like Trove and Yurka. Should we expect to see more and more of these?
Yeah, and I think a great way to think about this, Brian, is just to use a word that comes out of the technology sector, and that's to think about the stack. You often hear software developers talk about the stack. So on the web, the stack includes the Apache web server, and then some programming languages like PHP or Python, and some HTML and a web browser. And you kind of literally stack up these technologies, and then even below the web server itself, of course, there's binary code and hardware and these sorts of things. And so it's very helpful to think about it like a layer cake. And I often think about where DPLA and other digital libraries can play a role. And you're right, it is as a kind of layer, a thin layer that spans across multiple institutions and relies sort of up and down through the stack on others to, in a sense, hook into what we're doing and to profit off of what we're doing kind of higher up on the stack. So if you look at, for instance, digital libraries, there are parts of the stack that are related to digital preservation, which is different than access. So there are places that are storing files for the long run. There are places that are working on standards and languages for interoperability. There's software related to repositories. We're working on one with DuraSpace and Stanford University called Hydra in a Box, which is a implementation of a repository, a very popular repository called Hydra that we're trying to make kind of turnkey. And and so on. You can think about all these things in a stack, or as I've often called it, as an ecosystem that kind of works together, everyone having a kind of specific role within that ecosystem. And I think once you think in that way, it's a sort of very healthy mental model for how you can also collaborate together, because you're not trying to do everything yourself. There are things, for instance, that physical libraries can do that DPLA absolutely can't do, never will be able to do, and we need to really rely on physical libraries for that. And same thing kind of in other parts of the stack or ecosystem. There are entities that really rely on DPLA, rely on our data, rely on our API, or application programming interface, just a fancy way of saying our way of providing access digitally through those means to others. There are those who really rely on us to operate and to do things for the end user. So it's a really, in some sense, complicated, certainly more complicated than a single physical institution scenario. But on the other hand, it really does leverage the capacity of the medium and the technology to, again, create a kind of nice layer cake. And I'll stop the eating metaphors there, but hopefully it's tasty and baked to the proper temperature. Yeah.
I hope you get lunch again. Now that's a powerful metaphor, especially the ecological metaphor, which then lets us think in a more complex way about having the relationship between physical libraries, digital libraries, as well as other organizations, like Hydra, for example, which is based in Stanford, I think. Well, let's see. Let me ask everyone, do we have any questions at this point for Dan? Do we have any comments? Over in FTT, over in the Twitter feed, and people were very interested in your points about maximal access and also about the vital role that physical libraries play with getting citizens access to the digital world, which is really important.
Yeah. If I could talk just a few more minutes about the maximal access, because I think it's an interesting topic for me and I'd love to get reactions from everyone in the chat room about it. But I think if you look at open access, which again I've been a strong proponent of for 15 years, I think if you just think about open access, you may restrict your kind of mental model of providing really maximal access. I mean, after all, the public library is not open access, right? Or it's not, and it involves some commercial elements, right? To the end user, it is open, right? You walk in and you can browse the shelves, and that's a really wonderful thing. But on the back end, of course, it's paid for by tax dollars that are aggregated together, and there's all kinds of systems and big book vendors and Baker and Taylor as an intermediary to ship the books there. And so, and in fact, I see those mechanisms behind the scenes at Boston Public Library. So there's a case where you can maximize access while also, in a sense, engaging in commerce. And I think thinking about that also provides a kind of stepping stone to saying, well, what else can we do that potentially could, again, increase access, but it perhaps looks slightly different than just a pure open access model. The one example that kind of brought this to mind for me in DPLA is we were able to do a project with New York Public Library and First Book, and supported by and inspired by the White House and the Institute of Museum and Library Services to bring 3,000 award-winning and front list books from the big 5 publishers who are not going to give us those books on an open access basis, but we're able to license those books to be read by in-need children who are at Title I schools, children who are living below the poverty line. They license those in ways that, again, were not open access, but were very, very permissive compared to other mechanisms that we were able to get for other kinds of file types. So that's a program called Open eBooks. If you go to openebooks.net, you can see an introductory video that First Lady Michelle Obama did for the project. And we've been able to provide access to, effectively millions of kids to a huge digital library that, again, supplements what they can get at their public library, which has many more books on average than 3,000, but it gives them a chance to engage in reading, find a love of reading wherever they may be on a phone or iPad. That's a case where thinking of that as maximal access, that is a program that increased marginally, I hope more than just marginally, but it had a marginal increase, if you want to use the economic term, of access while not being a fully open access program. Now, having said that, we still want to push for open access as much as we can because it's the best case scenario if you're interested in maximal access. But I think that we should be open to other models as well, as after all, we have been with public libraries from the start in terms of how we structure them financially. So it's an interesting world out there. Again, I'd love to see more experiments to, again, have a marginal increase in access by whatever means, because at the end of the day, I think ethically that's the right thing to do.
Well, there's a one giant experiment going on right now that Michael Berman reminds us of. Let me just read you his question. He asks, how does the vision of maximal access differ from Google's vision of, quote, access to or organizing all the world's information?
Right. So it's very different than a Google style situation. I mean, Google is organizing information that is being put online, mostly by others. I mean, there are obviously example Google Books being one of them, and the Google Cultural Institute, where Google is in fact doing the digitization. The whole, raison d'etre of Google from the start has been that it's extremely good at what database folks call indexing, and they're super good at knowing what you're trying to find, and then they link out to those other resources, again, with some examples like Google Books and the Cultural Institute. What I'm trying to get at with maximal access is that we need to think creatively and not in an indexed fashion, but in one that is proactive, not just passively taking advantage of all the wonderful stuff that's put up on the web and then indexing it. Instead, we're trying to add to that store and doing that in multiple different ways. So, I think something like a Google Cultural Institute, I applaud them. And we talk to Google, we want them as collaborators. They do incredible feats of engineering, and that does add to access. That's part of providing maximal access is having commercial entities like Google put things online. I think what we want to avoid in any discussion around maximal access is any kind of rent-seeking type arrangement. So, when I talk about maximal access, people get worried that all of a sudden I'm going to be, moving over to the dark side and saying that everything should be commercially licensed because that provides access. And I'm not saying that. I think there are cases where licensing is perfectly the correct model, and I want, for instance, authors to get paid. So I'm not looking to leech any kind of profits out of the ecosystem, I guess, of our shared culture. But I am trying to find ways of marginally increasing access while not setting up commercial entities to again engage in rent seeking. So that has to do with any kind of entity that, for instance, has monopolistic power, which there are entities that you've probably seen,
Amazon,
for instance, Elsevier, Amazon, where they have very large shares or monopolistic kinds of access, and then they use that leverage to exact significant financial penalties, essentially, from institutions like libraries. And that obviously is a situation that's not providing maximal access. So again, I think that some combination, of course, there's always going to be commerce and there's going to be various financial models, but I think if we can work together, and that includes with commercial entities, to find ways to increase access for populations. I mean, there are certainly programs where normally commercially licensed databases, for instance, are made free to IP ranges in Africa and things like that are also, I think, again, seem to be part of the solution. So there's a panoply, I think, of potential conditions under which maximal access can be advanced, while also being on guard for the fact that there are, again, rent-seeking entities as well.
Dan, we have a bunch of questions coming in. and I'd like to turn them into the mingle phase of the forum.
Okay.
So what happens here, and this is new for some people in the audience, is Dan and I climb off the stage and we join the rest of you in the audience. And for the next 5 or so minutes, we talk about a specific topic. And the topic I have in mind is Dan's idea of maximal access. So how do you see that playing out at your institution? If you're at a college, university, a museum, a library, or an archive, do you see maximal access as a strategy that you're already pursuing? Or do you think this would be a good way for you to complement and strengthen your approach to open access? Or if this is brand new to you, what do you think? So for the next 5 minutes, clump up in groups of 2, 3, or 4. We'll hash this out, and then when we're done, Dan and I will climb back up on stage and we'll share what we've learned. Now, if you're new to this, just one thing is, if you don't feel like talking to other people in the audience, that's perfectly fine. One way of avoiding the rest of us bludgeoning into your space is if you mouse over your cursor, you'll see that there is one option with a little key on it. If you click that, that sets you to private mode. And if anyone wants to talk to you, they have to ask your permission to talk to you, and you can always say no. If you're, for example, if you're shy, or if your camera doesn't work, or you're in a public space, and we've learned this from surveys of forum members before, that's fine. If, on the other hand, you do feel like talking, you're extroverted, your mic and camera are good, or you're burning to talk about maximal access, fantastic. Move around. Now, one last point, if there's nobody in your room right now who wants to talk with you, that's sad. But let's say it is true. Click on the very bottom left of the screen. There's a little black tab that says the word mingle. If you click on that, it'll bring up a kind of film strip of all the other people who are here in this forum right now. So you can click on them and zoom into their room and join them. So for the next 5 minutes, what did maximal access mean to you and your work? Shindig folks, bring Dan and I off the stage, please, so we can start chatting. Welcome back from the Mingle session. I just had a really pleasant conversation with Amy and with John about maximal access in different ways, and Dan joined us. What you could take from that, Dan? What do you think?
Yeah, it was interesting. I pushed a little bit on the sort of interests of Amy and Scott, and I think we got into some interesting area to just think more broadly even than books. About just the state of our culture in a digital age, which it does exist in digital files, and you know, even this chat itself, right? There will be a recording of that, but what is the long term for that file? I want Shindig, talking to you, Chris, that to exist for a long time and to flourish commercially. But we've always had institutions then that, in a sense, preserve these materials for the long run. And so I think it's as I put it to Amy, it's more of a social problem or challenge than just a library challenge to think about things like books or video files or any of the things that we view as culture today, or these interactions. What their long-range prospects are, to me, is a really fascinating question, and I think very germane to what we were discussing earlier.
Well, I love that puckish phrase you used, is preservation by neglect.
Right. I was saying that a lot, by training a Victorianist and studying Victorian history, a lot of what we have is just diaries that were left in an attic and someone finds them 100 years later, or these sorts of things. It's a great term of art to think about. And the problem in thinking about preservation by neglect and the steamer trunk full of old photos in the attic is now the steamer trunk is, in this little black rectangle here, which will probably not function in 5 or 10 years. And I've got photos on it. There's no pathway for that to be around.
Well, this is a whole other issue, which we really need to devote a full session to. Preservation is a really enormous problem. But we have questions already. One of the reasons that we do the shindigs, the reason that we do the mingle, that stirs up a whole set of questions and comments. And we have one from George Station. He asks, in the DPLA, are there any serendipitous browse functions analogous to seeing items on a physical shelf?
Ah, that is a great question. Thank you. It gives me a chance to plug. Everybody should go to dp.la right now.
Absolutely.
Boost our site traffic. And one of the things you'll note is there are lots of serendipitous methods that are actually created by third parties. So folks that don't work at DPLA, most of them I have never met in my life, but are able to use our technical infrastructure and that thing I mentioned before, the API, to design new interfaces. And so all that you can see when you go down to our app library. So if you go to dp.la and scroll down, you'll see that we have an app library. It's not as big as Apple's or Android's, but it does have a variety of different views that third-party software developers have created. So some of the great serendipitous interfaces that I really like, I'm a very visual person. I like one called Culture Collage, which you could take a look at, which provides an endless stream of thumbnail images from DPLA's 13 million items. There's one that allows you to browse the entire collection by color. So if you really, really want to find everything that is fuchsia in America's libraries, archives, and museums, that is in fact possible. So go crazy on that. That's also there. And then there's also, I think, interfaces that we've created. Like we have a great map browsing system. If you go to the upper right on our homepage, you'll see that you can browse by location. And that brings up an open map that includes geolocated items. So we locate the items and their origin. And you can browse around and just in a chat room with someone from Arizona and someone from Florida, and you can zoom into your states and see what we've got from your particular location. So I think I'm fascinated by serendipity. And it's one of the things actually that physical libraries still do extremely well. You can run through stacks and just kind of bump into a spine, or you come into your public library and there's a display of new covers. And that's wonderful, and I think we need to keep that. And we're trying to do the same thing online.
What a great answer and a great question. As host, I have to resist the temptation just to plunge into the new apps right now. We have another question from Brian Gardner. And Brian, if your camera and mic work, how about if the Shindig folks can pull me off the stage and put Brian up in my place?
Hi there, how you doing?
Good. How are you, Brian?
Excellent, very good, thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the economics of open and maximal access. I definitely get the library as a publisher aspect, but the content creation costs are substantial, and authors need to be incentivized to create the quality content, which could exceed philanthropic or tax-based traditional revenue models.
Sure. Yeah. Right. So that's a great question, and I assume that includes things like payments to authors, which I'm not opposed to. I have 3 books, and I think I mentioned this in my most recent post around ebooks. Oddly, I get more royalties from my 2 books that are open access than by my 1 book that is closed access. Now, that could be because my 3rd book, which is closed access, is about 19th century mathematics, and maybe there's not a huge market out there for 19th century math, but it is the case that there can still be money in the system while still providing access, whether that's open access or more marginally improved access. So the program I was talking about before, for instance, there is a program called Knowledge Unlatched that just brings together many libraries that all commit to buying every book that Knowledge Unlatched produces. And together, for instance, if they're putting together their dollars, they come up with that first copy cost of $25,000 or $35,000. That's given over to the publisher. The publisher makes a file available to those libraries as well as to other libraries under an open access and generally a Creative Commons license. But they're also, in fact, at the same time, and I wasn't able to bring this up earlier, they also produce a physical book in many of those cases, and that are sold and that have regular royalty rates. And indeed, that's the royalties I get for the book that I wrote with Roy Rosenzweig on digital history. That exists both as a website, as an open access book, which about 100,000 people look at every year, which is wonderful. But it also exists as a print book. And a lot of people want to spring for the print book even after reading some of it as open access. They want it on their shelf, or they feel that a print book has certain affordances. They like to underline it. They want to keep it next to them when they're working on a website, a history website, or something like that. And so that book still sells, quite well, and pays me, more than a latte a year to have written it. And so I think there are, again, very hybrid scenarios that still involve commerce. Now, having said that, I'm not holding my breath waiting for Stephen King to publish his next novel as an open access file. But I think there are lots of scenarios where the access could be better. And I think there are lots of scenarios where, for instance, for most books, well over 90%, the entire commercial value of that book is basically gone in the first decade. Right? Most of the sales actually occur in the first 18 to 24 months. And yet we're in a system where generally the copyright for a book published today, knocking on all the wood around me, if I live to 80 or 90, it won't become open access in the natural pathway for that. That is, it won't become public domain until well into the next century. And in that case, you really are limiting access while not really enhancing the commercial prospects or the revenue for an author. And so I just think we need to think entirely in terms of the economic situations of books and other cultural artifacts like video and film. I think everyone is both threatened and potentially also supported by new modes of access and of revenue.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for a great question. I mean, someone named Brian, that's almost as good as having a beard. I know that's very powerful. But that's a really, really good question, and one that we're, as a civilization, still working through. Dan, I have another question, and this comes up in chat, Andrew Bonamici. And let me just read this because it's a pretty detailed question. He says, maximal access for me, I'm in a research library, seems like a good way to frame initiatives for digitization of unique primary materials from special collections and archives, connecting them to communities via channels like DPLA and Wikipedia, and encouraging creative, adaptive use of curriculum at all levels, as well as new scholarship. I guess that's not really a question so much as an observation.
That's a great summary. I mean, yeah, and as I said, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about the other aspects of maximal access. But as I said, the heart of maximal access is still open access. And we still do that through these basic mechanisms of digitizing rare and unique files and then aggregating them, bringing them together in one place at DPLA, and then aggregating an audience to use those things. And I think one of the really gratifying things of working for the Digital Public Library of America is that we see so many of these collections, literally 2,000 and growing collections that have been added to our collection, receiving traffic that it would be hard for those audiences to find a lot of those materials without providing this kind of centralized search location, and to the way in which everybody's been working together to get these things online and into the system. So it's really key what we're doing around open access. I hope it's worthy of widespread support, and I think there's a lot of different ways to participate in that notion of open access and in the larger frame that we've been talking about, maximal access.
Well, I think that it really points to both a growth and also development in ways that we haven't yet seen. I'm conscious of time. We're coming up on the hour, but I want to bring in a question from Vanessa Vale. And this is from Twitter. So Vanessa, let me just quickly read this. She asks about the relationship, if any, between the DPLA and the WDL. I think it's the World Digital Library.
Yeah, sure. So the WDL, which the Library of Congress participated in, is a smaller collection of really wonderful stuff. So it's got some thousands of items. I think total maybe around 12,000 items. But it's really the key documents from countries around the world, your declarations of independence and other riches like that. DPLA is at 13.4 million as we speak, and probably more by the time we finish, and has a different mission of including not only those central documents. The Emancipation Proclamation, for instance, is part of DPLA, but it also includes lots of other materials from all around the country and indeed around the world, because America's collections contain materials from around the world. So the mission's really different. I think they're very complementary. We would love to work more with the Library of Congress and other libraries. WDL is an international collaboration. DPLA has international collaborators at Europeana, for instance, which I mentioned earlier, and Trove and Digital NZ. I think we're all working together to see what we can do globally and not just nationally.
And the new Librarian of Congress should make that especially exciting.
Yes, we're delighted that Dr. Carla Hayden has been confirmed last week, and look forward to working with her as well.
Well, I look forward to working with you more, Dan. We're out of time, so I need to boot you off stage, or if this were vaudeville, we'd have the big hook, right, and just kind of pull you off.
Right.
Because I'm conscious of everyone's time, but I want to thank you so much for your generous time, for your questions, for your thoughts. You've instructed and excited everybody. So thank you again, Dan.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks to everybody who showed up. These were terrific questions, and I really loved the discussion. Thank you.
Well, Dan, if you have a minute after this, it would be good to talk with you. Maybe we can all chat, kind of after party. But let me just, as we hit the witching hour, let me look forward to the next few weeks. We have some unusual news to bring up. So first, next week, instead of having a regular guest, we're going to be at the NYS CIO conference in Skaneateles, upstate New York, in the Finger Lakes. So we're going to go to the conference floor, and I'm going to haul in presenters and participants as guests to talk about the CIO perspective. And again, as with Brad Wheeler's comments last time, we want to get a sense of what it's like to look at the digital world and the future of that from the perspective of a Chief Information Officer. So please come in for next Thursday. That's going to be an exciting time. And then the week after that, we have another live session. And this time it's going to be in Boston, not too far from Dan, I hope, at the Campus Technology Conference. So we have a bunch of guests and presenters that we're going to bring in and talk about the issues seen from that point of view. And if you'd like to follow that, that'll be on there's a link there to the conference, as well as the hashtag for Campus Tech. And there's one more thing on top of this. Some of you may have seen online that I'm launching a book reading project for near future science fiction as a tool of getting at the future of education and technology. So if you go to that tiny URL link there, you'll see that we're beginning our reading with Paolo Bacigalupi's The Water Knife, a pretty harrowing look at a climate change future in the United States. So we think that reading science fiction will be fun and give us some inspiration and ideas for the near future of education and technology. So for the next few weeks, you have a lot of excitement coming up. One more slide here I just want to bring up. If you'd like to find out more about these projects, there's fete.us for the Future Trends Report. There's shindig.com for these wonderful technologies. And let me once again thank everybody for contributing so much. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot, and I look forward to further conversations. See you next week. Bye-bye.